When I was a student, I got called in on a stroke patient. She had coded and they were doing CPR. They worked for 45 minutes, but she ended up dying. They cleaned her up and called on the family to say goodbye. But by the time the family had left, she had been both brain dead and without a pulse for more than 45 minutes. Blood had filled her entire brain and she was completely gray and started to smell. Suddenly, she had sat up and called for her family. The nurses rushed to get monitors and equipment back on her. They started working on her again. She ended up stabilizing and even said goodbye to her family, and promptly died a second time. I had an old lady come in by ambulance near death. She was a DNR, which, for those who don't know, is do not resuscitate. So we weren't going to do much for her. She didn't have any family that we could find anyway, and the hospital was full that night, so we had to keep her in the ER just for the time being. Again, she was near death. When you've seen enough people die, there's really no mistaking it, and she was almost there. Barely responsive, pale, cool breaths, heart rate was really irregular as well as up and down. We just turned the lights down and kept a close eye on her monitor, basically just waiting for her to pass away. About an hour goes by, and she's standing at the door of her room. She'd gotten up and put on all of her clothes. We were all like, what the hell? One of the nurses even went to check on her, and she said that she was hungry. Not knowing really what to make of things, we got her a chair, a bedside table, and even went to the cafeteria and got her a tray of food. She sat there, ate all of her food, talked with the staff a little bit. She seemed fine. After about an hour, she informed the nurse that she was quite tired and wished to lay back down. Well, we helped her get back into bed, and within 30 minutes, she was dead. I used to work in a skilled nursing facility, usually assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. One night, I'm in the linen room stocking my cart, and I heard someone shuffle up behind me. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around and there was no one else in the room. The door was still shut, too. Another lady started to complain that a man was coming into her room at night. Again, Alzheimer's, so I didn't think much of it. So to reassure her, I told her I'd check on her throughout the night. She complained of this man for every night for more than 2 weeks. When I asked her to describe him to me, "Oh, he's real handsome. Wears a black suit. Oh, he's right behind you now, honey." That freaked the literal hell out of me, and of course there was no one behind me. She died the next night in her sleep. I work in long-term care, currently, where a lot of residents always claim to hallucinate either small dogs or it's either children eating ice cream before they die. It's always facility-specific, too. One facility I work at, I have had about 6 or 7 residents claim to see a little girl eating ice cream, and then they die later on that night. I'm going to find that little shit because she's causing me so much paperwork. I'm an RN, and while I was a student, I was caring for a lady who had end-stage renal failure, had a DNAR, which is a do not attempt resuscitation, and was shutting down. We were having a little chat when she stopped, looked over my shoulder, and said, "Bill's here, love, I've got to go," and swiftly stopped breathing. Read her old notes, and Bill was her deceased husband. About 2 years ago, we treated patients during a fungal meningitis outbreak. Our acute care floor has a census of 20. During this, at least 10 to 15 were meningitis patients, age ranging from 20s to 90s. There are no shared rooms, and all the patients were in isolation, no contact with one another. Many of them had the same hallucinations: children in the corners of their rooms and auditory hallucinations of religious music. I did my clinical as a CNA in a memory care unit. I helped feed this woman who never really moved, never talked. It was like she was in a coma or something, and I could hardly get any real food in her, though I was able to slide in some special ice cream. For days she wouldn't move or have any response. I'm feeding her and talking to myself pretty much. After about 10 minutes, she slowly turns her head and says, "Oh, hello." Then she rotates her head back to a blank staring position and remains that way. Super creepy. A guy coded in my mother's ER, and after a while they ceased CPR. A few moments go by and the guy sprung forward, said something unintelligible, and died again. The family was in the room or in the general area when it happened. When I took my EMT class, the teacher had told me that they had a guy that worked after he had drowned and said they were in the process of zipping up his body bag as he had been dead for roughly 15 minutes, and he sat up and asked what they were doing to him. My teacher said that was the closest he has ever gotten to shooting himself. He was a paramedic for 25 years. Night nurse for 4 years now, and at an old folks home. I had an older person who couldn't sleep because of incredibly vivid hallucinations. She would describe voodoo people around her room that would just stare at her, waiting for her to die. I didn't take it seriously until the lady across the hall, who rarely ever spoke, started seeing them in her room too. Legitimate shivers. I was looking after a patient who needed one-on-one care when I still worked at one of the public hospitals. She had vivid hallucinations of people crawling on the floor and touching the feet and legs of anyone not in bed. She went on to describe in great horror story-type detail the person she saw touching my feet while I sat in a chair next to her for part of my shift. A couple of times a day or so after a resident had passed, their call bell would go off in their room. No one was in the room when the call bell went off on any of the occasions. We had one resident die pretty traumatically. Nurses had to perform CPR because he was a full code. That night, the midnight staff said they saw him at the end of the hall, just walking down like he always did. And then, the alarm on the door to the outside, it was a secured unit for Alzheimer's and dementia, had went off. It was the door he always tried when he was looking to get out. I work in a cardiovascular surgical ICU. We have a lot of messed up people, both physically and mentally, that come through our unit. We had a stretch of nights where each corner room of our unit, it is a perfect square, reported seeing a cat walking around. Not a friendly cat either, apparently. The thing was hissing at them. The accounts were so similar to each other, we actually spent probably about a half hour looking around for a cat, and then had security plan ops come look as well. No cat was ever seen or found, and 2 of those 4 patients coded the next day. I am a therapist in an acute long-term care facility. We have 4 main hallways. A lot of the action is on 302B. Residents will hear this little boy laugh. Some see him, some just hear him. They play with him and let him sit on their laps. It's very strange to see how comfortable a 98-year-old woman feels when talking to a little boy ghost. I work a stroke floor on the bot shift. Most of our patients are elderly. Apparently, there are two things that patients see before they pass away. Some will say that two men are walking in their rooms and telling them to get ready to leave. The patient will call and tell us that these men are big and abrasive in their demeanor. They are either terrified or annoyed when they see the two men. The other thing they will see is a little boy who will go into their rooms and try to wake them up. The boy is usually loud and runs around their rooms. The patients will call and ask who's letting children just run around late at night. Several nights, or even at the same shift, we're coding or cleaning the patient for the funeral home to pick up. I work nights in a long-term care facility as a nurse's assistant. I have two men under my care, and both of them are unable to use their call lights. They have severe dementia and debilitating Parkinson's disease, but still their lights are looped around their bed rail. One night, their light came on and I went to answer it, already confused and creeped out. I turned it off and left the room. Before I could get 2 doors up, the light came back on. I went in there, and both lights were unplugged from the wall and thrown under their beds. I fished them out, plugged them back in, and left. I've seen shadows standing over the dying, and felt a tap on my shoulder while doing chest compressions, so I knew that lady had passed. My town has 2 really old hospitals. One no longer functions overnight, and the stories are quite unsettling. No one cleans the old ER alone, because all of the lights and call bells go off. On other floors, there's a kid with his ball, a lady in a white dress, etc. A coworker was cleaning an entire floor utterly solo, which is quite the norm, and bounced between rooms because the cleaning solution stays wet for a few minutes. Upon returning to a freshly wiped bed, handprints were clearly visible. A patient had passed away during my shift. The patient was well known and liked on the ward. At handover that evening, I mentioned the patient had passed away and that the door to the handover room, which I had closed, had opened and just shut as I mentioned she had passed away. She was totally saying goodbye. Later that month, we were chatting about said patient at the nurse's station. Weirdly, a card which was pinned on a notice board just fell as we started talking about her. I went to pick it up, and it was a card from the patient's family saying, "Thanks for caring for their patient." When my mother worked as an ER nurse, a guy had came in from a car accident and was losing blood. In the midst of resuscitation, the man jolts awake and screams, "Don't let me go back there, please don't let me go back," and a few seconds later they lost him. I work in the memory care unit. I'm a CNA. We have a room that's a solo bed at the end of the hall with a woman who cannot move her body. She's pretty far gone memory-wise. So, when her call light goes off, it's terrifying to go reset it. She can't push it. We blame the cat a lot, but several times it was locked in another room.